go ahead and put it in the chat box. Hello, DWP is in the house, I see. Thank you, Jay. I also want to thank our sponsors, Culture Builds Florida and Silent World Dive Center out of Key Largo. They are our sponsors tonight. And tonight we have Matthew Lawrence, who I consider a History of Diving Museum ambassador in the community. He knows the museum well. He's worked on a lot of projects with us, and we really appreciate his area of expertise. He's the archaeologist in NOAA for the Office of National Marine Sanctuaries all over, not just Key Largo. He's based out of here, but he helps all of the sanctuary. He's a graduate from East Carolina University in their program in maritime studies. He has research interests including remote sensory surveys of the 19th century steam navigation and the U.S. coastal trading. He's an avid scuba diver, an underwater photographer, and as I mentioned, has been involved with the museum and helped us out a lot in the past with research and our featured exhibits. So I'm going to hand it over to you, Matt, who's going to share his screen and his presentation. And again, put your questions in the chat box.
Thank you very much, Lisa, for the warm welcome. All right, let me get my screen shared here so that folks can follow along. All righty, I'm hoping that people can go ahead and see my title slide here. Is there something that says Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary and Maritime Archaeology in front of everyone?
Yes, we see you.
Ah, fantastic. Well, thank you all for joining me this evening. Much appreciate your time. As Lisa said, I am very much a fan of the museum, and I'm hoping that this evening, my presentation on maritime archaeology in the Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary will be of interest to you all. And I'm really excited to see some of my friends and colleagues there out in the Zoom world. So thanks everyone for joining here. Well, why don't we get started? The Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary is part of the National Marine Sanctuary System, which is comprised of a network of underwater parks, 15 of them, and 2 marine national monuments. We are part of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration under the Department of Commerce. And the sanctuaries ring the United States and extend all the way out across the Pacific. We manage something like 600,000 square miles of ocean. Now, the very first National Marine Sanctuary was created in 1975 to protect the remains of the USS Monitor shipwreck off of North Carolina. And since that time, many additional sites have been added. I'm hoping that many of you have dove at other national marine sanctuaries across the nation. We have just tremendous diving at Gray's Reef or Monterey Bay, but I would like to particularly highlight the shipwreck diving that you can undertake in Thunder Bay and one of our very newest national marine sanctuaries, the Wisconsin Shipwreck Coast. So I hope all of you like to go to some cold water, visit those Great Lakes shipwrecks. They are truly fantastic. The National Marine Sanctuaries are special areas of the marine environment with conservation, recreational, ecological, historical, cultural, and archaeological and aesthetic qualities that made them outstanding. Generally, the United States Congress designates national marine sanctuaries. The Office of National Marine Sanctuaries, for which I work, seeks to manage these areas and conserve, protect, and enhance their biodiversity, ecological integrity, and cultural legacy, which is important for me, while facilitating those uses that are compatible with resource protection. And that can sometimes be a tall order, trying to protect these areas for current and future generations, but also allowing people to enjoy them. And I hope all of you, those of you who are not in the area here, will be able to come down to the Florida Keys and enjoy the Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary sometime in the future. So the Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary, as you can see from the map, extends all the way from almost Miami all the way out to west of the Dried Tortugas. It is 2,900 square nautical miles. And basically, if you set foot in the water off of the Florida Keys, you are in the Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary. So this is really a tremendously sensitive habitat, a very important place for the fishes and the corals. And as a result, it's one of the most highly managed marine areas in the world, with many state and federal partners who make this all happen. Now, the Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary dates all the way back to 1975, just shortly after the creation of the first National Marine Sanctuary, with the designation of the Key Largo National Marine Sanctuary, which is just offshore of where I sit right now here in Key Largo. So that was created in 1975, and Looe Key National Marine Sanctuary was designated in 1981. So after a series of ship groundings and some greater threats to the coral reef, various bills were put forward to create the expanded Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary that we have right now, and that was designated in 1990. The sanctuary has interconnected environmental and cultural heritage. The archaeological resources that I'm going to be talking to you all about tonight are intimately linked with the natural resources here. The coral reef just off of our shore here really defines the Straits of Florida and is what has caused most of the shipwrecks in the area. And now when you go out and dive these shipwrecks, you can see how enmeshed they are with the marine environment. And it is this interplay between the cultural resources, the shipwrecks, and the amazing marine environment, the fishes and the multicolored corals, that really makes it a tremendous place to visit. But back in the 19th and earlier centuries, those coral reefs were largely hated because they were such a danger to navigation and claimed so many ships as they were sailing through the Straits of Florida. The Florida Keys underwater cultural heritage can be grouped into a variety of different areas here. The cultural heritage relating to Native American cultures. We believe that submerged archaeological sites lie on the seafloor that may date as back as far as 15,000 years ago. And of course, Native American cultures were here in the Florida Keys up to the 19th century. I think someone needs to go on mute. Is there someone who could do that? Thank you. Beginning with European colonization and exploitation of the Western Hemisphere, we have an increased quantity of cultural heritage sites with all of the shipwrecks that resulted. And these can be grouped into European colonial sites, American sites, and our modern shipwrecks here. Now, in addition to all of these shipwrecks, we also have historic structures that are out in the National Marine Sanctuary. And these are generally comprised of aids to navigation that were established to try to help mariners stay away from these coral reefs and to safely transit the maritime highway that passes along the Florida Keys. All of you, I'm sure, are aware of the lighthouses that we have off of our coast here, but I'll be telling you about some reef beacons that are also located in the sanctuary. The sanctuary sits really at a crossroads of the Atlantic world. So much of the shipping that crossed from Europe over to the United States, over to the Western Hemisphere, and then were routing back to Europe, passed through the narrow corridor between Cuba and Florida. As a result of all of that maritime activity, the tremendous storms that we get here, and that dangerous coral reef, we estimate that there are approximately 2,000 shipwrecks thought to have occurred here in the Florida Keys Sanctuary. And that may not even encompass the full number, given that many hundreds of vessels that grounded on the coral reef were actually able to get off and were rescued and able to continue on their voyage. So you can see some of the maps here depicting the area and really how little was known about the particulars of the Florida Keys up until even the 18th century, when all of this maritime traffic was passing just offshore. Let me throw a little bit of terminology at you here. You'll hear archaeologists oftentimes speak about the sites that they study as maritime heritage resources or submerged cultural resources or historical resources. There are slight distinctions between these different terms. For example, submerged cultural resources have to be submerged, whereas a maritime heritage resource might be something like a lighthouse on a headland. So for us archaeologists, we get a little particular about where these things, how these things are used. But for tonight, we're just going to talk about our historical resources. These are those historical artifacts that tell us about the past. And they can, for the sanctuary, be shipwrecks, aircraft, aids to navigation, Native American sites or artifacts. These are non-renewable sites. What we have now in the sanctuary are all that we're ever going to have. And so it is particularly important that we do what we can to preserve them so that they're available for future generations to enjoy. Because they're our common heritage. It's who we are, what was important to us, and how we did what we did in the past. And again, if we don't understand how things were in the past, we don't have the perspective that allows us to move into the future. So why are historical resources important? Well, they provide unique information about our past, things that are not written in the historical record. Folks who sailed through the Florida Keys often didn't write down explicit information about their passage through, and they might not have actually even survived the voyage. And so we can look to our archaeological sites and learn about these past activities. Now, for the visitor, they provide exciting opportunities for recreational and educational experiences. There is nothing better for getting someone to connect with their history than being able to actually visit in person. And that's something that, while we may be able to do with some of our historic cities, is often not the case. And so when you're diving on a shipwreck, you can really get a sense for what it was once like to walk the decks of a vessel. And you can think about the people who were with you and really just how challenging it might have been. And of course, archaeological sites and historical resources attract tourism, and they offer non-consumptive ways to create the commerce of Florida Keys, which so much relies on tourism. If we do it right, these sites will be here for the future, and people will continue to be able to enjoy them without taking anything away from the Florida Keys. So they really are an important resource for the Florida Keys community. That's why it's really important that all of us who are visiting the sanctuary leave historical resources untouched. It's illegal to remove or damage artifacts, and damaging historical resources robs the American people of their history. And here's just an example of a shipwreck site, the Infante, one of the vessels of the 1733 Spanish fleet that wrecked here in the Florida Keys. The left photo depicts the site in the 1980s. It had already been heavily salvaged by treasure hunters prior to the sanctuary being designated, but you can see quite a lot of wood still visible on the site right there. I just visited this site again not too long ago, and this is what it looks like. Because of people poking and prodding and picking and hoping to discover treasure, there is almost none of that wooden hull structure left to be visited and appreciated. And I'm sure all of you, if you had the chance to dive this site, would much rather be seeing the shipwreck on the left than the shipwreck on the right. So again, these things are non-renewable. And when you take those artifacts away and you put them on your mantle, they oftentimes dry out and fragment into little pieces and are of no good to anyone. And you lose the context for which they're most important, the way that they can tell us about the past. Now, many people think that shipwrecks are out of sight, out of mind, that if they find something, they should just go ahead and keep it. But that's really not the way it works in a national marine sanctuary. And additionally, many people think that the environment is simply just going to destroy all these shipwrecks. Again, that is not the case. Look at that wreck on the left there. That thing had been in the water since 1733, and until people started messing with it, it was still very much preserved. National Marine Sanctuary regulations are set out to try to keep these things around and to allow people to enjoy them for the future. And so the prohibitions prevent people from moving or removing or injuring artifacts and archaeological sites, and it prevents folks from digging into or dredging into the seafloor or placing things on the seafloor that disturb these sites. So what does that mean for people who are visiting the National Marine Sanctuary? The idea is to take only pictures. You don't touch, you don't pick up, you don't move artifacts. You don't hand fan sediment to expose artifacts. That only hastens their degradation. So please visit, please enjoy, please look, take those photographs and share them with your friends, but do not take the artifacts home. At the Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary, our historical resource management falls into a variety of different categories here. We're here to inventory the resources that are in the sanctuary, to develop information to allow the National Marine Sanctuary to make informed decisions about managing this area. Our regulations permit participatory research, documentation, and the curation of historical resources. I've only been working here in the sanctuary since about 2009, and only full-time since 2017. And so there has been a tremendous amount of research that has gone on in the Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary before my time. And generally, I'll be speaking tonight about the research projects that I've taken part in. But I want to acknowledge my colleague, Maritime Heritage Coordinator Brenda Altmeyer, who has shepherded a countless number of projects along so that this information can be developed about the sanctuary's historical resources. There have been, many other really fantastic investigators who have shed light on the sanctuary's history. I'd like to recognize Corey Malcolm at the Belfisher Maritime Heritage Society, Shelley Smith from the Past Foundation, the folks at the Maritime Archeological and Historical Society, and the countless other researchers that have been working on some 60+ historical resource permits over the years. And of course, the work that we've done would be nothing without the efforts of Florida's Bureau of Archaeological Research, who were leading projects here in the Florida Keys even before the sanctuary was designated, and have developed lots of really excellent information about the sanctuary's archaeological sites. So with all of this information, we look to review the sanctuary's actions to avoid adverse effects to historical resources, and then provide the information to the public by developing community-based stewardship programs and interpreting the Florida Keys maritime heritage for everyone. So let me begin here with one of our really fantastic research partnerships. Indiana University has been a stalwart partner since prior to the sanctuary's designation in 1990. They've been conducting research since then on the Florida Keys National Marine Shipwreck Trail, of which they helped create. You can see here some of the imagery from Shipwreck Trail sites, the San Pedro, the two images on your left, and the city of Washington on the right. And Indiana University has really helped the Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary move into the 21st century by teaching staff about the use of photogrammetry to document archaeological sites. So the images that you see right there are stitched together from hundreds or potentially thousands of closely overlapping images that are processed through computer programs to result in 3D models or mosaics of these sites. And so you can see particularly there with the city of Washington, there's much more detail that you can develop from this kind of information as compared to the hand-drawn site maps that were first developed by Indiana University when the Shipwreck Trail here was created. So we really thank them for providing their expertise to help us learn how to do our jobs better. To my colleagues at Diving with a Purpose who are on tonight, thank you for all of your work. Over the past decade, participants from Diving with a Purpose, which is an avocational archaeology program, have been coming down to the Florida Keys on their own dime to help document shipwrecks. Between 2012 and 2016, the team worked on a site known as the Hannah M. Bell. This 315-foot long British steamship wrecked on Elbow Reef in 1911. It was carrying a cargo of coal. And we started out this project not sure as to the identity of a particular shipwreck on Elbow Reef. It was long known as Mike's Wreck. If any of you have been diving on Elbow Reef, you probably have dove Mike's Wreck. And together we were able to solve the mystery and determine that in fact Mike's Wreck was this steamship, the Hannah M. Bell. The Hannah M. Bell carried a variety of different cargoes during its life, from cotton to coal to naval stores, journeying back and forth across the Atlantic, connecting the southern United States to the industrial cities of Europe. On its last voyage, it struck Elbow Reef, and it was unable to be pulled free as the engine room and cargo holds were full of water. Ultimately, it was left and abandoned to the reef and to the salvagers, who then began to break apart the vessel and recycle it. The work with Diving with a Purpose has resulted in this fantastic archaeological site map that depicts the site. It's in about 20-25 feet of water and kind of splayed out as a result of the site forces, the tremendous wind and waves that have battered the site, as well as the wrecking process and the salvaging process, which has removed the steamship's engines and boilers and many of the other parts. But when you dive the site today, it's really a beautiful place to visit, and you can see all of the different parts and pieces of the steamship. And at one point on the vessel's side, it actually rises as much as 15 feet above the bottom. So it's one of the more unusual shipwrecks that have a significant amount of vertical relief in the Florida Keys Sanctuary. And so without the work of Diving with a Purpose, who donated approximately $25,000 a year of volunteer support to this archaeological site mapping project, we would not have this map of the Hannah and Bell, and likely would not have identified it as such. Continuing with the Diving with a Purpose program, after we had completed the Hannah and Bell investigation, we moved on to another steamship that was probably only about 200 yards away on Elbow Reef. It's obviously a dangerous spot as it kind of sticks out into the Gulf Stream and has claimed quite a number of shipwrecks, or claimed quite a number of ships. The site we began documenting, again, was not known at the time. It was known after the buoy that it sits next to, the, I believe, E3 buoy, and we set out to be able to document the site and determine what vessel it was. And so through archaeological research, we found that the site was the Acorn, another British steamship. This one had been built a number of years earlier in 1881 in Glasgow, Scotland, and it wrecked on Elbow Reef in 1885. It was bound from New York to Laguna, Mexico with general merchandise, grain, lard, and oil, and it was pushed into the reef during a storm and quickly holed, and as a result, was not able to be refloated and go on its voyage. One image I want to draw your attention to here in the picture is actually the center hub of the steamship's steering wheel, the brownish round plaque. This was actually discovered just this past year by a recreational diver who decided to remove it and take it home with them. And I'm very, very happy that they basically decided better of that choice and contacted the sanctuary and turned it over. But it would have been far better had they just alerted the sanctuary that they had found it, allowed us to go out and map where it was located, and then to recover it. And so I would ask that anyone who finds something like this to contact me so that we can treat it appropriately. But fortunately, it concurred with my determination that this site was in fact the Acorn. I would have been very much chagrined if it had a different name on it. Here's our archaeological site map of the Acorn. This is only a 165-foot long vessel. It's much smaller than the Hannah M. Bell. And this site is sort of scrambled. Unlike the Hannah M. Bell, which is nicely laid out, this site actually has had portions of its hull flipped around. At the right side of your screen is where the vessel's lower bow is located, but a very large portion of its upper bow is all the way at the top left corner of this image. And so it speaks to the destruction of the steamship, and again, the salvage that occurred afterwards when the salvagers removed the vessel's engines and any of the cargo that they were able to find. So this was, without doing this archaeological site mapping, we really wouldn't understand what we were looking at on the bottom, as it looks kind of like a jumble of parts and pieces of a ship. But through the careful documentation of the Diving with a Purpose team, we were able to develop this map and better understand what had occurred to the Acorn. I mentioned earlier that in addition to our lighthouses here in the Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary, folks who were looking to prevent shipwrecks also established reef beacons. And so think of these something like mariners' signposts. These pilings were driven into the reef at various locations along the reef and were labeled with either a letter or a number. And that letter or number corresponded to a map that mariners would carry to tell them essentially what portion of the reef they were passing, because many vessels wrecked because they felt they had passed a portion of the reef and they could then turn and make their way one way or another. And in fact, they hadn't passed the safe zone and they ran into the reef. And so these reef beacons allowed folks to have a visual signal to clue them in as to where they were located. And so these were actually established in the 1850s by a predecessor organization of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration that I work for, the Office of Coast Survey. And so these beacons were placed at a variety of different reefs, and many of them are still partially standing upright. You can see some of the photos here of pieces of these beacons, or these very large iron pilings, actually where they then later installed a lighthouse, for example, where they felt that it was worth spending the large amount of money to put in a lighthouse because it was such a dangerous spot. But these beacons were a much less expensive way to warn mariners about the dangerous reef, but they were repeatedly knocked down, and their design changed over the years, adding turnbuckles and a variety of other things to try to keep them upright. I just recently returned from an archaeological expedition earlier this summer, known as the Quicksands Archaeological Survey. This project sought to investigate the shipwrecks and archaeological sites that are west of Key West in the Marquesas region of the sanctuary. You can see the map sort of that delineates this area. This was a multidisciplinary investigation funded by NOAA's Office of Ocean Exploration Research. And my partners for this project were the University of Miami's Rosenstiel School of Marine and Atmospheric Science. And so we were able to charter a live aboard dive vessel and head out to this area and begin to have a better understanding about the historical resources that lie in this area, which had not been very fully studied up to this date. Our project used a variety of different research methods. We deployed a side scan sonar and magnetometers to map the seafloor and locate archaeological sites. We established a magnetometer on the Marquesas Keys there to help us gather data to correct our magnetic field readings to make them more understandable. And one of our primary research tools you see there with the divers was a camera-mounted DPV array with cameras mounted on it that our divers were able to fly back and forth over these archaeological sites, collecting that photogrammetric imagery to document them. One of our primary objectives was to investigate the remains of the steamship Valbanera. This vessel was a 400-foot long transatlantic steamship. It was built in 1906 in Scotland, and it was carrying passengers from Spain to Cuba in 1919 when it wrecked on Half Moon Shoal as a result of a tremendous hurricane. This shipwreck is probably the vessel with the single greatest loss of life in the National Marine Sanctuary here. About 488 people died when it struck Half Moon Shoal, and absolutely no one survived the wrecking event. The 1919 hurricane was really a tremendous storm, one of the strongest to strike the Florida Keys here. It decimated Key West, and reports were that water was as high as 12 feet up on the southwest portion of the island. And so you can see some of the damage that occurred, really a mess of Key West Harbor there, and many vessels were sunk. The Valbanera really didn't stand a chance being out in that hurricane. It had tried to get into Havana Harbor, but the harbor master there had closed the port, fearing that vessels might actually wreck and ground in the harbor channel. And so the Valbanera had only to go out into open seas and battle the hurricane. And hopefully, I'm imagining the crew and the passengers were feeling like just a really horrific experience. Here you can see the general track of the hurricane as it passed through the waterway between Cuba and Florida Keys. Really a tremendous storm with hours and hours and hours of tropical storm force winds. At the end of it, when folks began to sort of get back out on the water, they reached Half Moon Shoal. The image on the right is all that they were able to see of the Valbanera, which had wrecked in about 20 to 25 feet water on that 20 to 25 feet of water on that sandy shoal. Just a very small portion of its mast was projecting through the surface. While many folks have never heard of the Valbanera now, at the time it had a really strong legacy. In the 1930s, Ernest Hemingway released a short story called After the Storm that told the story of a salvage diver that had gone out to a steamship and had attempted to salvage parts of it, but was thwarted in his efforts. This was, while not explicitly mentioned as the Valbanera, it certainly makes sense that that's the vessel that Ernest Hemingway was basing his story on. But after the vessel sank in 1919, there were salvage expeditions that were launched to recover portions of the Valbanera from Cuba. And you can see some of what was probably hard hat divers that were used to try to recover valuable portions of the ship. The really tragic thing is that no bodies were ever brought ashore and properly buried as a result of the storm. And so there is no place that you can go to commemorate the Valbanera and those who were lost on it except there at the Valbanera site. The shipwreck on the seafloor is really a sight to behold. This 400-foot long steamship is mostly entombed within this large sandbank with only portions of it projecting above the sand. You can see some of the photographs that we took during the expedition. There are places that you can swim into the vessel's cargo hold and see other parts of it, but most of the 400-foot long steamship is buried under the sand. The photogrammetric modeling that we were able to do of the site really helped us out here because the visibility was very low. At points we could see as much as 10 or 12 feet, and the strong currents made it very difficult to dive on this site. And so using this technology, we were able to generate these 3D model perspectives of portions of the shipwreck. And so you can see the piece right here is probably the vessel's bow. Some different views of it, and you can see how much of it is actually still within that sandbank. And this is a portion of the vessel's stern. Here are two different views of it. Again, the photogrammetric modeling really allows us to look at these sites, rotate them in 3 dimensions from all different sides. And there's no way you could have taken a picture that actually, a single picture that encompassed this entire piece of wreckage. So this is really an important tool for us to be able to use to document the site. And when we return, which we plan to do, we'll be able to see what sort of changes have occurred to the site over time. So in addition to the Valbanera, there were a number of other shipwrecks that we investigated out in that area. One of them is a site known as the Eagle Boat. This was a World War I era, essentially naval patrol craft that was designed to intercept submarines. This is an unusual design. It was built in a factory, actually Henry Ford's factory, as a way to test mass production techniques for building of naval craft when everyone was desperately in need of naval vessels during World War I. Unfortunately, it was not a success in that none of these vessels actually made it into service really during World War I. It just took much longer than anyone anticipated to build these. But approximately 50 or 60 of these vessels were built and ultimately were shared by the United States with many of our partners around the world. And so they served in other navies during the interwar years. And so this site is pretty unusual. We haven't actually identified which of the Eagle boats this is. The picture that you see there, number 57, is just a good example of one. But we certainly hope to be able to tell the story of this eagle boat and try to figure out how it got to where it is off of the Marquesas Keys. Not far away from that eagle boat is another vessel, another military vessel, the USS Coral. If anyone has ever gone through the Lakes Passage heading west towards the Marquesas Keys, you'll notice a large shipwreck that still projects above the water in that area. And many people cruise on by. And it wasn't really until about 2010 that we were actually able to identify this through the help of one of our permittees, a woman named Delaney Kirwan, who investigated this site and found a historic image that linked it to USS Coral, which was a yacht, actually, another yacht owned by Henry Ford, amazingly enough, that was later converted to a naval vessel and patrolled out of Key West during World War II, trying to track down submarines and respond to mariners in distress in that area. And so you can see the image on the bottom left is the USS Coral about 25 years ago, when it was still very much intact and upright above the water. The image in the upper right shows that the vessel has begun to slip into deeper water and is now much more submerged. But there's quite a lot of the site left, and you can see bits and pieces of the vessel's steam engine or its steering quadrant there in those photos. It's a really fun site to snorkel if you ever get the chance. So I wanted to offer all of you folks some thoughts on how you might get involved in the work that I do here in the National Marine Sanctuary. There's a number of different ways. Of course, the first and easiest thing to do is go dive the Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary Shipwreck Trail, a collection of 9 different shipwrecks spanning a variety of our historical periods. This was established in 1997 with the help of Indiana University and East Carolina University. They're at varying depths. Some are something you can see snorkeling, others are deeper, as much as 120 feet deep. And they were selected for their biological and archaeological and aesthetic qualities. So many of these sites are very, very beautiful to behold. And so go out and enjoy the Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary Shipwreck Trail. If you go to our sanctuary website, you can download slates that show the shipwreck structure and provide a guided tour for these shipwrecks for you. And if you happen to take some pictures, we'd love to see them. If you're a little bit more interested, I would really recommend joining our Diving with a Purpose team. As I mentioned, they're an avocational underwater archaeology training program. And through the Diving with a Purpose program, you'll learn underwater archaeological site mapping over a week-long period. Typically, we choose a shipwreck and teach folks on land for a day and then set them out in the water and begin the site mapping process. And as a result, we really hope that you become an advocate for underwater cultural heritage preservation. If you visit their website, divingwithapurpose.org, you can find out more information. This week, I was actually supposed to be diving with the team here. We had planned to conduct an investigation of the Hen and Chicken's steel brick wreck. But unfortunately, as is the case, we had to sideline our plans due to COVID. We just did not feel like it made sense to bring a large group down here to the Florida Keys and risk the chance that someone might get sick. But this site still needs desperately to be investigated. It's a gorgeous wreck on Hen and Chicken's Reef, which is off of Tavernier. We have this report that tells us that this was a barge carrying bricks. There are a few bricks left on the site, but the reconnaissance dives that I've made show that it really doesn't look like your typical barge. In fact, it looks like the heavily built steel hull of possibly a steamship or a deep water sail. And so I'm hoping our investigation and our mapping that we'll be able to reveal what kind of vessel this was and be able to tell the story of the Hen and Chicken's steel brick wreck. Another way to get involved is to participate with the Florida Public Archeology Network. They are our partners in heritage preservation and outreach and have 2 really fantastic programs, the Heritage Awareness Diving Seminar and the Heritage Monitoring Scouts program. We are going to be holding a virtual Heritage Awareness Diving Seminar coming up very soon, October 19th, 20th, and 21st. Typically, we do these over a couple days in person, but again, due to COVID, we're having a virtual session. These are going to be 2 hours each of those evenings, the 19th, and 20th, and 21st. You'll hear lectures from archaeologists from the Florida Public Archaeology Network, from the Sanctuary, as well as Florida's Bureau of Archaeological Research. The idea behind HADS is that it provides scuba instructors the ability to teach the HADS specialty for their divers, essentially making their divers aware of the tremendous underwater cultural heritage. But it's of great interest to many folks who are just interested in this topic. So please visit the website that I posted right there to learn more about it and to register for the seminar. Similarly, the Florida Public Archaeology Network has the Heritage Monitoring Scouts program. The Heritage Monitoring Scouts are a system that teaches everyday people to go out into their communities and to document the archaeological sites that they see. Throughout the Florida, archaeological sites are under threat from development or from sea level rise, and in the case of our shipwrecks, a variety of different factors ranging from divers who are collecting to even hurricanes. And so the Heritage Monitoring Scouts program teaches folks about systematically gathering information and providing that information to the land managers so that we may have essentially a citizen science view of all of these different archaeological sites, far more than we would ever be able to visit in person. So there are 2 virtual trainings coming up, October 21st and November 18th. Please go to the FPAN HMS website there to learn more about the program and to sign up. Well, thank you all for your attention this evening. I would highly recommend that you visit the Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary website to learn more. We have sections all about the Shipwreck Trail, as well as the Reef Beacons and many of our other historical resources. Of course, I'd encourage anyone to go ahead and contact me. You can reach me through my email there. You see matthew.lawrence@noaa.gov. And I would ask, hey, if you're out in the sanctuary diving and you discover historical resources, please leave it in place, but take a photo, get the GPS coordinates, and contact me, as we'd love to hear it. There are so many archaeological sites that have yet to be discovered, and we really appreciate the public's help with that. Thank you. That's what I have.
All right, thank you. I do have a couple of questions ready for you, Matt, if you're ready.
Great.
So the first question.
Stop sharing my.
Perfect. All right, so our first question is, how long does it take to cure an artifact once it comes out of the water?
That is so dependent upon what kind of artifact it is.
Sure.
Artifacts that are comprised of, say, stone or glass or things like that generally need a certain level of rinsing just to remove the salts. It all depends in those cases if those salts are firmly entombed or not, but it becomes much more difficult when you're talking about metallic things. Iron and copper take specialized treatments that really vary depending upon the size of the artifact. And of course, organic material is very, very challenging. Wooden artifacts require sometimes decades of treatment. There are examples of the recovery of several historic shipwrecks, such as the Vasa in Sweden or the Mary Rose in the UK, that have been under treatment for decades as they're being preserved. So it really varies. Again, it's very expensive, and it's not something that the average person really should need to get into. So I would encourage you all to leave it where it is. It's much better off.
Interesting. Thank you. Do you guys have a facility where you do that kind of work, or is that part of much larger projects as well?
So typically we would contract with another organization. There are specialized labs at, say, the Mariners Museum in Newport News, Virginia.
Oh.
They've been charged with conserving the artifacts recovered from the USS Monitor. And there's another situation where the steam engine and the rotating gun turret that were recovered from the USS Monitor about 8 or 9 years ago are anticipated to still have 10 or 20 more years of conservation before they can be exhibited in a dry state.
Wow, that's really interesting. Thank you. All right. So our second question is, what was the cargo on the last trip of the Hannah M. Bell?
The cargo was coal. They had loaded a cargo of coal in the Newport News area and were heading down south to drop that off. And so when you dive the Hannah M. Bell, you can actually still see some large chunks of coal, but it's likely that much of the cargo was salvaged shortly thereafter, and the bits and pieces that they couldn't get oftentimes get washed away in the hurricanes because the coal is relatively light.
Interesting. All right, we have one more that was sent through the chat, but it's not too late. If anyone out there has questions, they're welcome to either unmute themselves and ask or send them to the chat. We're still monitoring that as well. So our last question from before is, why didn't the ships travel closer to Cuba to avoid the reefs of the Florida Keys? And that's when you were talking about those markers that still remain.
Absolutely. Well, the idea was the ships when they were heading essentially from the southwest to northeast, they could be out in the middle of the Gulf Stream and easily be passing through the Straits of Florida and only coming in contact with the reef in situations where storms and things like hurricanes were blowing them into the jagged reef. Now, those vessels that were passing from essentially the northeast to the southwest through the Straits of Florida there wanted to sail or steam as close as they could to the reef because that's where the Gulf Stream is the least. And if you're in a relatively inefficient sailing vessel, that Gulf Stream current could actually make you go backwards. It was very common for that sort of situation to happen. And so they would attempt to hug the shore a little bit closely. And that's actually what we believe happened with the steamships that are wrecked on Elbow Reef. They were trying to, even though they were a steamship and could, fight against that Gulf Stream current, they were getting a little too close in. And because of the way Elbow Reef sticks out, when some stormy weather came up, they were pushed right into the reef there.
Interesting. All right. So then the last question I have, unless anybody sends one right now, is actually a question we were talking about on the HDM staff earlier today. And we were wondering if you had any special advice for divers who were diving on archaeological sites where people lost their lives. If there was any special considerations you would recommend for divers to be respectful.
Yeah, certainly. That's that whoever is sort of asking that question is certainly thinking along the right lines. We do want to be cognizant of the loss of life that occurred in these situations and be respectful, particularly of human remains that might exist on the site. And so, in general, I'm not a big fan of people getting up close and taking photos of human remains and doing things like that. Certainly touching them, disturbing them, bothering them in any way is really an unfortunate sort of macabre practice that I would certainly not endorse in any sort of way. So just be aware that might be the situation. Think about the loved ones whose family member might have been lost on that particular shipwreck, and to enjoy it for the history and think about the people in the past.
Certainly. Thank you. And with that, I think I'll pass it over to Lisa, who's going to say some thanks and give some final information as well for our visitors.
Yes, thank you, Linnea, and thank you, Matt. That was great. I have done the Heritage Awareness Diving Seminar and also the monitoring scouts, and both of them, you find out some really great tips and information, and it's a way to give back. It's a way to help to preserve that history. So thanks for bringing those up. And of course, Diving with a Purpose is a wonderful organization, and they do a lot of work every year, like you said, coming down and volunteering with the museum and kind of helping to preserve that history. So they're great. So we want to thank you. I want to thank NOAA for allowing you to do the presentation for us tonight, and remind everybody who's on the call that the History of Diving Museum offers the Immerse Yourself presentations on Zoom, but for those of you that are traveling in the Florida Keys, we're located at mile marker 83 in Isla Morada, and just keep us, check out our website, divingmuseum.org, and you can